Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I know many of you have been waiting for this week when we talk about sex work and commercialized sex. This is one of my favorite weeks of the semester in this class, so let's get started. Of course, you know by now I often like to start with some definitions. The definitions on this slide are from the World Health Organization, but hopefully will give us a common framework to work from this week. So we're going to talk a little bit about commercial sex, which is defined as the exchange of money or goods for sexual services, which of course involves a sex worker, someone who is providing the sexual services, and a client who is providing the money or other goods in exchange. But it also involves other parties as well. So if we're thinking about street level prostitution, that may be a pimp or someone else who is managing the sex worker, but could also involve things like an owner of a strip club or manager, could involve a service, for example, that coordinates the activities of various escorts and things like that. So there's always at least two parties involved, a sex worker and a client, but it does frequently also involve other parties as well. Sex work is the umbrella term that we use to talk about the provision of sexual services for money or other goods. We'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like in later slides. But note that it says sexual services and not just sex. And of course, thinking about what we mean when we talk about sex workers. These can be women, men, trans people, non binary folks, basically anybody who is receiving money or goods in exchange for those sexual services. And the important thing here is that these folks also need to consciously define these activities as generating income or benefits in some way, even if they don't consider themselves sex workers. And that's going to be really key. That is, in the 1970s, there were some radical feminists who talked about marriage as a form of sex work, in that women specifically were exchanging sex and sexual services in exchange for a place to live and perhaps an allowance or a husband's income that provided for food. But those women likely did not consciously define their sexual activities as income generating, and so under this definition would not be included in the category of sex worker. Sex work also comes with a lot of different job descriptions, so to speak, and comes in many forms, which can often be very drastically different from one another. And culturally, we have a tendency to lump all sex work together and generalize out across this variety of circumstances, behaviors, payment structures, etc. And that is especially true when we see critiques of sex work, of folks who are critical or trying to get rid of sex work in some way. That they tend to think about like street level prostitution, which is in fact one of the most dangerous forms of sex work, and use that to generalize across sex work altogether. Some variables we might consider when differentiating or thinking about different types of sex work. First, and perhaps most importantly, the level of agency or choice that sex workers have to engage in work or otherwise. And this is something that might be helpful in thinking about distinguishing from human trafficking, or what is sometimes called sexual slavery, as a form of sex work. And perhaps some folks would say that sexual slavery or human trafficking is not actually sex work because there is no agency there, right? It is a form of slavery that the person involved providing sexual services does not usually have a choice in that matter. This also is a way to think about differentiating sex work that is done by minors forcibly, and that as a form of child abuse, as opposed to sex work. But when we also think about level of agency or choice to work, we can think about within sex work folks who engage in survival sex. So engaging in sex work in order to survive, to be able to pay their rent, to be order to have a place to stay, whatever that might look like. And then there's a level, and these are not specific or particularly scientific, but this idea of folks who engage in sex work because it pays better for than other professions. For example, sex work might pay better than working at the Kroger. And then there are folks who engage in sex work because they simply want to, because it is their occupation of choice. And they could do other things, but have decided that what they want to do is engage in sex work in some form. Other variables we might consider when thinking about the differences between different aspects of sex work, whether the work primarily takes place indoors or outdoors, having whether someone is actually engaging in sex, having sex as part of their work, or is providing a sexual service such as erotic massage, dancing, phone sex. We can also think about the level of contact. Is there sexual contact? How much of it? Is there no contact? So, for example, if someone is working as a webcam performer, they will not actually have any contact, certainly not physical contact with their clients. Whereas if someone is a dancer, they may have some level of physical contact depending on the club that they're working in, up to full physical contact for massage or other sex-based work. Can also think about whether workers are sort of self-employed, whether they're independent, or if they're working for others in some way. Think about the synchronicity, so similar to an online class, this is an asynchronous class, meaning that I put up content and you all come and watch it when you have time, versus a synchronous class, which would require us to be online engaging at the same time. We can also think about sex work in a synchronous versus asynchronous way. So like pornography is usually an asynchronous sex profession, that the films are filmed and they're edited and they're distributed and the performers are not actually performing live for folks, as to opposed to other synchronous forms of sex work, whether those are online or in real life. And there are probably other ways that we could differentiate within sex work, and you might think of some of those on your own. We often see this lumping together of all types of sex work at work in the pornography industry too, especially for folks who are critical of pornography, and the use of mainstream heterosexual and often very brutal or abusive pornography, using to stand in for the full spectrum of pornography as well. Another thing we want to think about is that sex work is actual work. And if we can understand sex work or think about sex work as just another type of work or labor similar to other industries like being in construction or working in higher education, or working at the grocery store, that we can think about the different ways in which the structure of the industry perhaps is impacting people as workers. And so sex work certainly involves various forms of physical labor, which might actually be having sex, but could be other forms of body work. But thinking about certainly dancing as an obvious sort of physical aspect of the work. But if we're thinking about folks who perhaps like work in phone sex call centers, the physical aspect of their work might be that it involves sitting for long periods of time. Sex work can also involve walking or standing for long periods of time, and thinking about the physical toll that such labor takes on someone's body. Also think about the different body maintenance that is often required for different types of sex work, thinking back to our week on bodies. Sex work also involves a lot of emotional labor sometime. Escorts, other sex workers will often talk about that sex is not always the most important thing that they provide for their clients. And a lot of their work is really about listening skills and building empathy, and the appearance, at least, of authentic connection with another human being. And in fact, in many sex work jobs, that the skills that are used are very similar to those we might expect out of folks like therapists or social workers. And so thinking about the way in which we value those skills differently in professions like mental health than we do in sex workers. Of course, different working environments also is going to make the experience of sex work look different, depending on what type of sex work you're engaging in. We know that there can be often extreme differences in the amount of safety and security that folks have as workers. Indoor sex workers face significantly lower rates of violence, sexual assault, and other crimes such as robberies. and that also the compensation or the valuing of different types of sex work can be drastically different. Working as a sex worker can involve a very respectable level of middle class income, but it can also be something that folks are just able to scrape by on, and that often depends on what type of work they are engaging in. Um, Another thing we know is that different folks that have different identities, because sex work is a profession that often relies on someone's appearance and their body and their identities. We know women of color are often paid less for the same services that white women provide. For example, in exotic dance or strip clubs, women of color often are scheduled for fewer shifts or for the less lucrative shifts where there aren't as many patrons, because they are considered less desirable to clients. And I put that less desirable in quotes, as you'll see in our notes. And it's unclear, we don't have enough research to know whether this is actually an accurate representation of client taste, that clients actually do prefer white women dancers, for example, to women of color, or if it is a perception by club owners. Either way, that is very clearly racism in action, but that there are, identity and all of the different things that we have in our culture around valuing different people and different identities differently also often make their way into sex work, either in the form of discrimination or differential compensation, or as we often see in pornography, as exoticization. And while those identities, women of color identities, might be more desirable, they are often in a way that is exoticized and tokenizing. One of the most important aspects of sex workers' ability to organize and advocate or even unionize for better protections and better working environments is the legal status of their profession, and their ability to do things like organize and advocate for themselves can be severely limited, especially in places where sex work is illegal. When we're talking about the legality or the legal status of sex work, we usually use three major categories, and these are not hard and fast categories. They are often not particularly well defined, and what is considered part of each category can often vary by study or report, but it is a helpful way to think about the different aspects of legal status for sex work. So those three categories are: one, sex work being criminalized, which means that sex work or various types of sex work is illegal and is therefore punishable by law. And this is the case in most US states, that all aspects of buying, selling, and organizing sexual services are illegal, and those are classified in different ways state by state. But when we think about criminalization, we also want to think about who the target of the regulations are. Are they really focused on criminalizing sex workers themselves? Are they targeting clients, the managers, or those third parties that are involved in sex work, or some combination of those three? And in the US, in most states, actually all three folks involved, all three parties involved in sex work are subject to some level of criminalization. The second category we talk about is decriminalized, and that means that sex work or various types of it are still officially illegal, but the regulations may not be strictly enforced, or perhaps when enforced are minimally punished. And so also thinking about the United States, as I said, sex work is illegal in most places, but enforcement and punishment can vary widely. And a good analogy for this is thinking about drug laws and drug criminalization, where in many states, for example, pot is still illegal, but the regulations around it are sometimes minimally enforced. And so depending on what type of sex work and what is happening and in what state you're in, while sex work may be technically illegal, it may also be decriminalized. The third category is sex work that is legal, or legalized sex work. And this, of course, means that sex work, or various types of it at least, are considered legal and therefore are regulated to some extent by the state. The US, in Nevada, there are a few counties in Nevada that have legalized brothels and sex work, and that in these counties, the brothels that are there are subject to strict regulations, which usually include mandatory HIV and STI testing, as well as sometimes involving curfews for employees. It is important to note that in those counties in Nevada where it is legal, those tend to be the least populated counties. Those are the farthest from the large cities such as Reno and Las Vegas, but that there is some level of legalized sex work in the United States. Of course, the pornography laws are somewhat different, and you might think about that as both straddling the line between decriminalized and legalized, depending on what state you're in as well. And the legalized, there are actually many countries around the world where sex work is decriminalized or is full on legalized. And actually, this gives us a space to talk about how we might engage in greater protections for sex workers, or the way that the lack of protections for sex workers are often linked to the criminal status of the enterprises. Perhaps the most famous example of legalized sex work is the Netherlands. And this is a great sort of case study of the shift from decriminalized to legalized sex work. And sex work was actually technically illegal, but was largely tolerated and decriminalized until 2000, when sex businesses were formally legalized by the Netherlands. And with that legalization, brothels and other sex businesses were to be licensed and needed to then comply with state rules about safety, sanitation, fiscal accountability, meaning are they paying their workers and how much, as well as health. And the actually stated aim of that legalization process was to protect and improve the position of sex workers, and to prevent the exploitation, particularly of illegal immigrants in sex work, as well as minors. Germany is another example where sex work is legal, and sex workers are allowed to work in Germany both as part of businesses such as brothels or as individual contractors, so basically working as sex workers out of their home or other spaces. Germany also has regulations about where sex work can take place, and so sex businesses must comply with various regulations about health and safety and hygiene, as well as location. And all businesses and freelance sex workers must conform with various taxation laws, compulsory health insurance, planning, and labor regulations. And so really thinking about the different ways in which the regulation and legalization of sex work opens up possibilities for supporting sex workers as workers in similar ways that workers are supported in other industries, with things like health insurance, and other support. And one of the wonderful things I think about Germany's laws is that sex businesses must also supply condoms and enable sex workers to access health and social counseling services. And of course, similar to the legalization of various drugs that we're seeing in the United States, especially pot, various states are starting to realize that when you legalize something and regulate it, you can also tax it. And so in many places where sex work is legal, it becomes part of the taxable income that supports the state and its ability to provide things like social services. Our last topic for today is going to be talking about sex work consumers, folks who actually purchase or buy sexual services. And much of the academic research energy is and has been spent on understanding who is providing sexual services, the sex workers themselves. And we do know significantly less about who is consuming sexual services. We do know that while sex workers come from just about every gender identity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic background, racial and ethnic group, we know significantly less about the consumers of sexual services. We do know that they are mostly men. They tend to be mostly men, but other aspects vary widely by location, by type of sex work, and all of those sorts of things. So I'll finish up today with just a few more things we do know about the consumers of sex work, specifically about men who consume sex work from women. One thing that we do know about consumers of sex work generally, particularly men, is that lifetime prevalence in an area, so for example, a country, of consuming sex work is almost always higher than the percentage of those who have paid for sex in the last year. So, for example, in Britain, we have a good sense of about 8.8% of men have ever paid for sex in their lifetime or engaged in sex work as a client, versus 1.3% in Britain in the past year. Similarly, in Denmark, 13.1% of men have consumed sex work in some form in their lifetime, but only 1.7% of men have done so in the past year. We also know that places where sex work is legal, at least in part, often have much higher rates of consumption of sex work than countries where it is illegal. That probably stands just to basic logic that if something is legal, people are more likely to engage in it and than if it is illegal, even if it is decriminalized. And there was one interesting study I found that is linked in the notes to the slideshow that was of men who were clients of women sex workers in 3 cities: Sao Paulo, Brazil; Cuernavaca, Mexico; and Tampa, Florida. And in this study, they found that 26.5% of men had paid for sex in Sao Paulo, 10.4% in Cuernavaca, and only 4.9% in Tampa. And sex work is legal to some extent in both Sao Paulo, Brazil, and in Cuernavaca, Mexico, and it is not in Tampa. So you see there the higher percentage of prevalence in the 2 countries, 2 cities where it is legal than in the city in the US where it is not. Interestingly, this survey, this study also found that in all 3 cities, men who had sex with both men and women in their lifetime were more likely to have ever paid for sex. And that was also true for men who were older. So older men were more likely to have paid for sex or to be clients of sex workers than younger men. But in Sao Paulo and Cuernavaca, clients also had a higher educational attainment level and were less likely to be married. So in those 2 cities, folks who had more education and were not married were more likely to solicit sex from a sex worker, but this was not the case in Tampa, where educational attainment and marital status did not seem to have an impact on whether or not men were engaging with sex workers. So some interesting stats. There's still so much more to learn, and a lot of work is yet to be done. A lot of this research is being done in public health spaces, thinking about STI and HIV transmission, but certainly a lot of other sociology studies, particularly around gender and sexuality, have some really interesting results and research going on around sex work, including around consumers of sex work, not just providers of sex work. That's it for this week. I hope you have a great week and enjoy the materials. There's some readings that have been posted to Canvas, as well as some interesting things I'd like you to peruse, some data from Pornhub on their yearly stats, as well as the map I mentioned around the legal status of sex work across the world. Have a great week.